Buenos dias, bienvenidos, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. Congress established the Wilson Center some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. What that means is that we are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. Our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations for policymakers. With that in mind, today's event is extremely timely, as Secretary Blinken will be hosting a Foreign Affairs Ministerial tomorrow with countries from this region who are involved with the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity initiative. At the Wilson Center, we believe in trade and the power of harnessing enterprise diplomacy, which seeks to leverage innovation, private enterprise, and economic collaboration to advance American leadership and achieve diplomatic objectives. The United States ranks as Latin America's largest trading partner and its largest source of foreign direct investment. U.S. goods and services trade with the Western Hemisphere totaled an estimated $2.4 trillion in 2022. Mexico has passed China as our top trading partner, and Canada is our second largest trading partner in the U.S. When the U.S. is involved in strengthening economic ties with allies, we are advancing our foreign policy goals, strengthening our national security, and projecting American leadership around the world. An important case study of this type of diplomacy is the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. The agreement was signed in 2006 and entered into force in 2012. Before the FTA was signed, U.S. exports to Colombia was about between $12 to $13 billion. In 2022, U.S. exports reached nearly $29 billion. This is good news for the U.S. and good news for Colombia. In general, trade has improved the standard of living for countless people, brought products within reach of everyday consumers, and in many developing countries has helped to lift more than 1 billion people out of poverty. It is time to prioritize trade in our foreign policy. It could be one of the best tools we have for protecting our interests abroad and at home. To compete effectively across the globe, we need to use every weapon at our disposal, and we can't afford to hold anything back. To discuss these important issues, its implications, and offer recommendations for the future, we are honored here at the Wilson Center to bring for today's event. Two of our most distinguished entities are putting today's event together: the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom and the Joseph B. Gildenhorn Fellow for Enterprise Diplomacy. We are joined as well by our moderator this morning, Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, former member of Congress from Wisconsin, former ambassador to Tanzania, and former administrator of USAID. Joining him on the panel will be Her Excellency Carolina Barco, who fought tirelessly for the passage of this free trade agreement in its inception, first as Colombia's foreign minister from 2022 to 2027, and then served as Colombia's ambassador to the U.S. Senator Roy Blunt, who is our inaugural Joseph B. Gildenhorn Fellow for Enterprise Diplomacy, also a champion of trade. He represented the state of Missouri for 12 years in the Senate and 14 years in the People's House, also known as the U.S. House of Representatives. And finally, President Iván Duque. President Duque served as Colombia's president from 2018 to 2022. We are honored to have him here at the Wilson Center chairing, of course, the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom. Gracias, señor presidente. And to kick things off, I'm going to ask Ambassador Bill Brownfield from the great state of Texas, who is also a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm contractually obligated to always mention Texas whenever I introduce Bill. And great, that's right. Former U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, Venezuela, and Chile, he will kick things off. Ambassador Brownfield, the floor is yours.
Before I begin, may I thank the Wilson Center for calling us all together on what is unquestionably the hottest, most miserable day that we will endure this year, if not any year, here in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And a second quick note, yes, I am aware I have a burn spot on my left collar. I was not looking at a mirror this morning when I got dressed. I am aware of it, so 1, don't stare at it, and 2, don't ask me about it. With that, Senator, Señor Presidente, Embajadora y Ministra, and Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, it is said on the program that I'm going to give a keynote address. I will not. I will offer what I'll call a scene setter, which lays out to some extent the history, which many people here are already aware of, but you're going to have to hear it once again, the history of how we reached where we are today on the U.S.-Colombia, or Colombia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Ladies and gents, the United States of America discovered free trade apparently sometime in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. Yes, I was alive then, as were many of you, by the way. And in fact, as you might expect, having discovered it, they kicked out as early as 1988, the first of our serious free trade agreements, and that was the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which was augmented by 1994 with the addition of Mexico into NAFTA, at that time the largest free trade agreement that the United States had ever signed and promulgated. In 2004, we cranked out the first free trade agreement with a South American nation, and this was Chile, where we got to, by the way, just in case anyone is wondering, by a vote of the United States Congress, and specifically the House of Representatives in 2003, that permitted Trade Promotion Authority, meaning the entire House had to vote up or down without right of amendment, the actual agreement. It was passed in 2003 thanks to the efforts of the then House Majority Whip, who gave the Speaker his final view in terms of what the vote would be, and the vote passed, ladies and gentlemen, by exactly 1 vote. And who was that gentleman? Why, ladies and gents, he's seated, I believe, about, if you're looking from your direction, in the front row, about 4 seats from the left. He went on to become the senator from Missouri. At that time, he was a representative. He probably wanted to talk about that in the course of his presentation, but tough, I've already stolen his fireworks. In 1991, we put together what we call the Andean Trade Preferences Act. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? It involved Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, but it wasn't a trade agreement, in that it was literally statutory legislation from the United States Congress. It required regular renewal in order to stay valid, if you will, and it did not cover a great deal of trade territory for those 4 nations. It was, in fact, an additional element in our counter-narcotics and anti-drug efforts in the course of the 1990s and for a couple of years in the 2000s. It collapsed, to all intents and purposes, sometime around 2002, for a fairly simple reason, and that is Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, even Alberto Fujimori in Peru, and Carolina and Señor Presidente. I have to acknowledge that Dr. Samper and his presidency in Colombia did not help a great deal. But the point, ladies and gents, is that this convinced Colombia that the solution would be a free trade agreement. No more of this ATPA sort of stuff. And why? 1, it would be comprehensive, and 2, it would be permanent. Once passed by both national assemblies or legislatures, it would endure forever or until a formal revocation of the agreement or treaty by one of the 2 governments. Surprisingly, the United States government, whose executive branch was then run by George W. Bush, was equally enthusiastic. They were looking to show that the nature of the special relationship between the United States and Colombia. They wanted to send a signal, if you will, to the rest of Latin America as to how positive U.S. engagement in the region could be. So, easy peasy, right? You have two presidents and two governments that say, we want to have a free trade agreement. No, hell no, in fact. It's not at all easy or simple. Why, from the U.S. side? Every single kind of issue group or industrial group or economic group in the United States of America takes a strong position on this or any free trade agreement that the United States enters into. Organized labor has never seen a free trade agreement that they did not at least initially, hate and despise to the best of their ability. I will not speak for then Ambassador Barco, but I am told that even her legendary patience was at times stressed or stretched by the U.S. citrus fruit grower and their associations, or the cut flower industry of Colorado, or, God help us, the Louisiana sugarcane industry, all of whom had to receive some sort of special protection. The human rights community, again, it's a free trade agreement, but you can't have trade, apparently, without human rights, which is fine, but there's an intense amount of dialogue with them as well. And I recall having a long discussion in around 2007, maybe 2008, over the issue of child labor, because some of the small coffee growers in Colombia, wait for this, would actually have their children, their teenage children, working on the coffee plantation. And this was obviously wrong, although no one apparently told that to my father back when I turned 15 in the state of Texas, and he gave me 5 minutes of instruction on the tractor and said, go to town, and you're not going to be paid for this either. At the end of the day, however, both governments, as Eddie pointed out, reached a conclusion and signed the agreement in February of 2006. Are we done? Of course not. That would be far too simple. It now must go through both national assemblies. And I will say, and Carolina might challenge me on this, but I swear, I think we brought as many as 250 members of Congress, and there are only 535, down to Colombia, some for multiple visits, to kind of push, explain, convince, cajole to vote the correct way on the free trade agreement. I believe 1/2 or more of the United States government's cabinet, the president's cabinet, came down to Colombia for visits, usually over long weekends, because there's no such thing as taking time off for a long weekend when you're trying to get a free trade agreement through. I swear to God, Ambassador Barco and I saw more of one another between 2007 and 2010 as we were working U.S. congressional delegations than we probably have for the rest of our lives combined together. That said, in 2006, some of you may recall, the results of the November elections at that time were, as then President Bush called it, a good old-fashioned thumping, where the Republicans lost control of both houses. It became absolutely clear that the Democratic-controlled House and Senate were not going to give George Bush the free trade agreement that he wanted. That said, Barack Obama came to office in January of 2009, and God bless him, he actually understood the value and importance of this free trade agreement. And with his pushing, it was, in fact, voted through. Took 10 years from time of start to time of final approval and implementation. Was it worth it? I say a resounding yes. I will make this statement. The United States of America and the Republic of Colombia are better off still today for a reason of this agreement. That said, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with that old adage. Free trade agreements are kind of like sausage or legislation. They're good things to have, but you don't want to watch them while they're being made. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is a high honor and indeed a distinct pleasure to invite to the podium the Right Honorable President of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green, and the distinguished panel.
As always, a very tough act to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I think we all agree that we're at a crossroads moment for trade, crossroads moment for the Americas, and this discussion, I think, can be helpful as we explore the choices that are to be made in this crossroads moment. I think that we have heard from Ambassador Brownfield a little bit about the sausage making. I'm going to ask a few questions here in the limited time we have. And Carolina, Madam Ambassador, if I can begin with you. As Bill mentioned, you were Colombia's foreign minister when the FTA was originally signed in 2006. So you've heard from the Brownfield side. How about the Colombian side? What were your thoughts? And I'm sorry that you had to see more of Ambassador Brownfield in that time. Anyway.
As you can imagine, it was always enjoyable to see him. It made life in that difficult period that we were going through, which was challenging. It worked out very, very well because I think the bipartisanship that has characterized our relationship with Plan Colombia and as we worked together on different issues was fundamental also during this period. And I don't think the Colombian government and later the Colombian embassy and the Colombian American embassy in Colombia and the Colombian embassy here worked really, really hard together. And I think that was one of the incredible strengths that we had. So it was a pleasure working with Ambassador Brownfield. I think, yes, I was going to start, but I think Ambassador Brownfield told the interesting story that when the FTA came up, Colombia had already had preferences because of ATPA, which had been fundamental in that it was to address the issue of drugs, but with the understanding when we talk about free trade, that by creating more jobs, by having trade, that was the better way to address this issue and create stability. So that the ATPA was in for 10 years, that's when our flour business grew so tremendously, and a lot of the different sectors grew, and it was important for our agriculture where we were facing all these issues. So that when President Uribe comes in, ATPA, which had been set up by President Bush 41 on a trip that he went to Colombia in 1990 when the whole issue of the drugs was starting, in a very courageous moment also because that was the time of Pablo Escobar and there was a lot of concern. Later as an ambassador, I had the chance to meet with a lot of the people who worked with him. And there was this feeling that maybe he shouldn't go down to Colombia, but he felt that it was important to go and meet with Alan Garcia of Peru, with Jaime Pazamora of Bolivia, and President Virgilio Arco of Colombia, and talk about the issues and see what we needed. And what we needed was economic development. And so, in a way, trade started there. And it was a one-way, and it was limited to half of the number of products that were later open with the FTA. But I think that was an important moment. When President Uribe comes in, the ATP DEA at that point was almost finished. ATPA had finished. We were starting ATP DEA, but only for 4 years. And President Uribe knew that we needed to get a free trade agreement going. As Ambassador Brownfield said, Chile had just gotten their free trade agreement by one vote, but we were hopeful that the relationship we had would help us. So one of President Uribe's first meetings with President Bush was to talk about the possibility of the FTA. Robert Zoellick, who was the USTR head, went down to Colombia, and he's, with his great intelligence, but also his very serious way, he said to President Uribe, this is very important, but it's difficult. And just because we're friends, we're going to have to work very hard at making this work for both of us. And so that was the beginning. It took 4 years to be able to sign it. And that's where then the whole problems came of moving forward.
So did the Colombian business community understand what a difference an FTA could make?
Oh, absolutely, because as we were negotiating and the ATPA had finished and we'd gone into ATP DEA, we were having to renew the ATP DEA every year, which made it very insecure. So that if you have an insecure environment, you don't invest. And so the business sector wanted to have the security. And this was also just directed at trade. And what we really wanted was investment. and investment both in manufacturing, but also access to services. And as we'll find, and as we look at what came out of the FTA, tourism, the work in the financial sector, et cetera, have all become very, very important. And this is what the FTA offered us. So the business sector was very invested. It was an important part of the negotiating team. The Colombian government had the business sector right next door and would negotiate and tell them what was being negotiated on the table. So it was very, very close. And this was something that Colombia really wanted and worked very hard at.
Senator Blunt and our Gildenhorn Fellow, welcome. Good to have you again. You voted in favor of the Colombia FTA in 2011. 66 votes in favor, a strong bipartisan effort, obviously 2-1. Why did you feel at the time that it was in America's interest to support an FTA with Colombia?
Well, as Ambassador Brownfield pointed out, being a whip in the House, the idea that we'd have twice as many people vote for an agreement as voted against it was very alien to my experience. I'm sort of Colombia, as Carolina knows, as President Duque knows, really in so many ways Colombia all the time, from Planned Colombia, later Peace Colombia. It never occurred to me not to be for this. Is my first trade vote, I guess, in the Senate. And really, we always knew if we got the bill to the Senate, it would be fine. But it was the first experience I ever had where I was part of that fine. Didn't have to worry about, okay, where are these people? How are we down to one vote? One vote on TPA, I think one vote on Chile. One vote on we did a lot of trade agreements, and every one of them barely passed. As the whip, I always had about 5 or 6 people who were willing to do it, but really didn't want to do it. And we, every time, had to use every one of them, occasionally with a tear in a member's eye, because I know one member, it cost him his next election, but he thought it was the right thing to do, hoping somebody else would do the right thing and he wouldn't have to, but he did. And the agreement is so good. And of course, you know, we did have this period where, particularly under President Reagan, free trade was just seen as one of the fundamental freedoms. That free trade led to the other freedoms being stronger for all the reasons Ambassador Barco mentioned. And I think we've seen that, but these trade votes are never easy. I believe President Obama was the last president to have trade promotion authority, and he never asked for it to be extended. And neither President Trump or President Biden have asked for it to be offered to them. And so, you know, we're at a moment where politicians are back to where trade's hard to explain at home, so let's not do it. You know, the numbers of jobs added by trade are never expressed to the public like the one out-of-date factory that had to close because of trade. I was glad to do it. Again, this is our longest hemispheric relationship, our diplomatic friendship with Colombia. They are our #1 trade partner in South America. Virtually every state is impacted by this Colombian agreement, and I hope we don't lose sight of the importance of life impact on people in both countries when both of you are doing what you're best prepared to do and most efficient at doing, and the other country gets to benefit from your efficiency, and you get to benefit from their efficiency, and standard of living goes up both places.
I will say, by way of disclosure, in my deep dark past, I was an assistant whip with the whip here to my left. One thing I'll say, and I think one of the reasons you're particularly well qualified to talk about this, people misunderstand what whipping is. Whipping is going to the floor and being able to answer difficult questions on how members are impacted and why things are good. And so I think it's a real tribute to you and the whip operation in how you made the case, member by member, at a time when there was a lot of special interest pushback. And so being able to explain that to individual members is important, and it is a rare thing to be able to actually do something twice and be able to come to the Senate and see it over. So great to have you here. President Duque, so we've heard a bit about the history of how we got there, and we've heard a bit about from America's end why it mattered. In your case, you have tried to take what we call enterprise diplomacy, economic statecraft, and business investment to new heights. So how do you see what that free trade agreement has done for Colombia, and why did you think it was so important then, and what have you seen now?
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Green. It's a great honor to be in this panel. Senator Blunt, Ambassador Barco, Ambassador Brownfield, Eddie. I want to highlight three things. The first one is that the free trade agreement, in my opinion, has been maybe the most successful foreign policy the U.S. has ever embraced with Latin America. Even stronger than the Alliance for Progress in the 1960s, because it created stability, predictability, and the possibility to grow opportunities over time. And I think that was essential. And in the case of Colombia, and I think Ambassador Barco framed it in a very nice way, it was bipartisan and bicameral. But it's also very important to put this in a broader context. There was the failure of the Doha round within the World Trade Organization. And initially, you remember in the Bush administration, there was this idea of getting approval of the FTA, which was obstructed by Chavez and the Kirchners and many of the extreme left governments in Latin America. So instead of maybe pushing it back and maybe look to new options, I think what the United States correctly did was, let's work through what at that time was called within the trade community as the spaghetti bowl. Let's start getting the bilateral agreements with different countries. And Chile was a great experience. And I think Colombia correctly saw in the Chile opportunity the way of building the case. And the fact that it was bipartisan and bicameral became very attractive, although there was a lot of resistance in some sectors in Capitol Hill. Nevertheless, I think the numbers that we have today speak by its own. Colombia has in the U.S. the #1 trading partner. We have more or less 31% of our overall exports to the United States. Even when are non-mineral related, you see a stronger weight. The U.S. represents almost 25% of Colombia's imports, but the U.S. represents 32% of Colombia's foreign direct investment. And this is growing. Just to mention few examples. In the last 6 years, Colombia got the approval of avocado, access to the United States. And the exports have grown by 6,000% since the moment we got access to the United States. Lemon, which was a product that we never saw easily to enter the United States, has grown over more than 650%. And these are opportunities. These are formal jobs that are created in the Colombian countryside. So I think that the free trade agreement is an exemplary measure. I have to say something because I think we also have to look into some mistakes that occurred. The fact that the free trade agreement was approved in 2006, but it took until 2012 to put it in shape and in functioning mode, I think it's something that should never occur again. Because after the majorities in Congress changed, we started having a lot of pushbacks also from sectors that wanted to, let's fine-tune some of the labor chapters, let's fine-tune here in some human rights chapters. And it was based a lot in pure politics. And if that agreement would have entered in 2007, maybe the results that we will have today will be much bigger. So I want to highlight that. But I also want to put something in the counterfactual mode. Imagine that this free trade agreements had never occurred. I would tell you that what would have happened in the region is that China would have invaded with free trade agreements the whole region and would have taken a larger advantage of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. So I think this was a measure that was done at the right time with the right instruments. And let me also highlight this, Ambassador Green. We have to look to this experience and make the voice louder, that this works, that this is good diplomacy. And what happened with Ecuador has to be seen as a red light, because Ecuador is not a trade threat to the United States. It's a much smaller economy than Colombia, Peru, or Chile. And when President Lasso was in office, he wanted to push for a free trade agreement, which basically could have been a copy-paste of any of the three that I just mentioned. And there was not a political good environment in Capitol Hill. So he never got it. But instead, he signed a free trade agreement with China in 6 months. So I think it's very important today to put back the trade agenda as a substantial part of good diplomacy between the United States and Latin America. For Colombia, this has been a major success. And now we see not only opportunities from the sectors that have come to invest in Colombia, but we have also seen, for example, the possibility of Colombian services providers to find immense opportunity in this market. So I will always say that this has been the best bipartisan, bicameral diplomacy that has ever been embraced with Latin America, for sure.
Carolina, let me build on that. So it's not only bipartisan, bicameral, it's multi-administration. So at a time when there seems to be some doubt about trade's prospects going forward, the Colombia experience shows that done the right way, done patiently perhaps, persistently, you can actually build a trade agreement that crosses certainly political lines back here. I can't speak enough to Colombia, but it can be done, but may take some time.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I mean, what we saw and we lived with the free trade agreement was I arrived when it had been negotiated and was signed 6 months after I arrived here. So I knew
we've got someone who got to vote on it multiple times and someone who got to.
Exactly. And so when, so I thought, okay, I start my work, which involved, Ambassador Brownfield talks about 250 congressmen. I don't know if it's that many, but there were about 27 or 30 CODELs led by Congress and other SECDELs. Condoleezza Rice went down with a group. Carlos Gutierrez, who was Secretary of Commerce, went down 5 times, the Secretary of Agriculture. I mean, it was a real commitment on the government to help us, and we were committed to receiving, and anytime anybody went down, President Uribe would receive them. It's this kind of relationship that we worked with Plan Colombia and with the FTA, showing on both sides interest and making the effort. President Uribe came 14 times to the U.S., President Bush went twice. We worked with the Chamber of Commerce and had the Business Council. We had businessmen coming up here. Our Minister of Trade went all over the United States. We visited those states that were very worried. I went with Senator Baucus and other to visit his state, and we visited a lot of states. So it was a really strong, concerted effort. I went up on the Hill, and I had 1,400 meetings with different congressmen during my 4 years.
I wouldn't wish that on my enemies, by the way, having been in office.
It was very interesting. It really was. I really, really learned a lot. But it just shows that we had to talk. We had to explain, because there was concern by sectors, certain agricultural sectors that were worried, or confection or leather, but also the human rights and the labor. Why? Because Colombia at that moment was facing incredible violence. And so there were a lot of labor members who were teachers or were outside in these very dangerous places, were hurt. And we did have to take special measures. So I had to go up and explain what we were doing. Our Attorney General came up here. So it was an issue of talking and convincing. I spent several meetings with Trunca, who was the head of AFL-CIO, who said to me, I appreciate your visit. I appreciate the fact you want to come talk to me, but we're not going to support it. And he was that clear. But I think these kind of conversations are fundamental. So when I was here 4 years, it didn't pass. I tried to do my best, and I thought I'd left at least something set up. Then President Santos is elected with President Obama here, and they decide that maybe what we need to do is work on some labor rights, and there's a labor plan that is negotiated. And with that labor plan, President Obama presents it again to Congress and asks them to vote on it. Korea, the president of Korea was coming. There was great interest in signing the Korea agreement that was also waiting. And so I'm very grateful to Speaker Boehner, who said, fine, we'll do the work. There was a whip, the work was done, but we're going to vote the trade agreements in order, the way that they were presented. So first Colombia, then it was Panama, and then Korea. And the three were voted in such a civilized way after having worked for 6 years. Mm-hmm. First, they were voted in the House. Then I was invited by David Dreyer to have a cup of champagne, and then we went up to the Senate, and it was voted there. So in one evening, in 4 hours, or maybe more, the three agreements were voted, and it was done.
And you had a lot of champagne.
And a lot of champagne. And I was very happy to vote, to celebrate for the U.S. and for Colombia. So it was patience, it was working together, and it was making also compromises and listening and addressing the issues that were on the table.
So I'm going to pick up on that first to you, Roy, and then to Ivan Duque. So part of what you've just described goes well beyond the normal economic benefits that we always talk about and we tend to evaluate free trade deals upon. You're suggesting that the process and the provisions that come with signing a binding agreement also build better relations in other areas too. Roy, talk to us a little bit about that from the U.S. perspective. Why is trade good for elements and challenges beyond trade?
Well, I'm one of the advocates of congressional travel, particularly places you would be afraid to go otherwise, but it brings the members together. You know, if Ambassador Barco or Ambassador Brownfield are right, maybe 200 members went to Colombia, and maybe 190 of them had never been to Colombia before and would not have gone otherwise. That in and of itself is a bonding experience. You begin to see that. I remember the first time I went to Medellin, the only thing I'd seen about Medellin before was some depiction in movies of Medellin, a pretty small village filled with drug traffickers. And we come over the top of the hill and look down in the valley and see this this big city. And I was back there later for a joint NIH effort on Alzheimer's that we're doing with the country of Colombia. But your sense of what another country is about is so greatly enhanced by both the visits with the ambassadors and thinking about the country and then seeing the country even better. And of course the binding intertwined economic relationships make you think differently about a country. You know, we have Missouri businesses that are fairly significant in Colombia. Missouri agriculture, very connected to Colombia, and I still think that works. Temporarily, China appears to be the one thing that hasn't worked out quite like we thought it would because of their incredible ability to appropriate all of our technology and to work in the way they do is different. But I think in almost all other cases, you just see that trade works out in a way that brings the economies together and people together, and again, the economic benefits of trade and the economic challenges of tariffs to raise prices with the possibility of creating a few more manufacturing or processing jobs it seems to me that nobody looks at the return on investment or the return on action there in the way that they should.
President Duque, so trade gets the conversation going, but it goes well beyond just the provisions of the free trade deal.
So I think, Mark, when the Ivan Duque Center was created with the term freedom and prosperity, I want to put this in the context of trade, because what a free trade agreement does to a country that engages in long-term relationships with the United States, it enhances freedom, economic freedom, and it also produces prosperity. I was in office 4 years in the presidency. We had to deal with a pandemic. We had to deal with the largest migration crisis that any other Latin American country has suffered. You helped us like no other person while you were in USAID. We had to face a hurricane category 5. So imagine all those three items together. And when I look back to my presidential terms in terms of foreign direct investment that was triggered by the United States Colombia Free Trade Agreement, it grew by 109%. So imagine that foreign direct investment from the U.S. in Colombia, in the midst of these three challenges, increased by 109%. What does that mean to the country? More employment, more formalized jobs, more long-term engagement, but also the possibility for Colombian firms to create bonding in elements as crucial as technology, for example, and the quality of services. So it is undisputable what a free trade agreement can do for a country.
So,
and let me say, and let me put this also in the context of bipartisanship of the United States for Colombia. Bill Clinton worked on Plan Colombia. President Bush moved forward with the free trade agreement. President Obama supported Colombia and many peace-building policies. President Trump supported us to face the humanitarian crisis in the border zones. President Biden made Colombia a strategic ally, non-NATO member. So the evolution of that bipartisanship has been great. And the fact that we celebrated 200 years of our bilateral relationship was very significant. But I have to say, if there's something that made that relationship practical in terms of closing the social divide, was the free trade agreement. And I have to say another thing, that in 1999, Colombia was in the cover of Foreign Policy magazine as a country that will be on the brink of becoming a failed state. And that today is a member of the OECD, also with the support of the United States. That has occurred in great matter because of the existence of that free trade agreement. So I think we don't have to be shy. We have to be really vocal about the importance of trade. And if I may suggest it, even looking to the next U.S. administration, either if it's re-elected President Trump, President Biden, or President Trump come again to office, I think there has to be an agenda of trade with Latin American countries. It happened in Central America. It happened with the Dominican Republic. It happened with Colombia, with Peru, and Chile. We should do the same with other countries, and also with the Caribbean. This, because it benefits, creates much better environment of freedom and prosperity.
So in the time we have left, let's talk looking forward. So, Carolina, there's a lot of talk about nearshoring, friendshoring, a different model, obviously in some ways. And here in the U.S., people often think Mexico when we think about nearshoring and friendshoring. But from the Colombian perspective, what does Colombia have to offer as we talk about such relationships and such agreements?
Well, I think what's very interesting about the Mexico relationship, which clearly has a USMCA and the border and that very close relationship, of course, it was a country that was going to profit very much. But if you look at Colombia and you look at geography, we are closer to the eastern part of the United States than Mexico. We got from Cartagena to Miami and to New York, we're much closer than trying to get things over from Mexico. So we want to make the argument that we should be looking at Colombia as a way to get closer to the U.S.
But you're not biased or anything like that.
No, it's just a fact of life.
Just
you
the
know,
facts.
It's just the facts. It's the geography if you look at it. But secondly, you know, Colombia and Mexico have had a good relationship. And in fact, in auto parts and in chemicals and pharmaceuticals and all that, we work together. So maybe we should be thinking about how we can complement each other and work together in trying to address and take advantage of all these new policies, the IRA, the CHIPS, the America Partnership, et cetera, and strengthen it. And Colombia, per se, has a lot of areas where it can work. We're seeing that the countries that are picking up quickly have a base either in the digital or have a base either in the pharmaceuticals from which to build. And we feel we have it. We also feel we have to work hard at making this work, because it does require not only setting out the framework. We have to see what steps we need to take together, both U.S. and Colombia, in preparing our skilled labor, in having the adequate infrastructure, digital as well as others. So I think I'll leave theirs because I know that my other panelists have things to say. But I think it is a wonderful way. It goes along the lines of what President Duque is saying. We need to continue to strengthen our relationship in these areas and address the new challenges we have, geopolitical in this case, of how do we get the production chains closer, with friendly countries.
Yeah.
So I think this works in both of our benefits once again.
So, Roy, let me ask you this. You and I both come from flyover country. Neither the East Coast nor the West Coast, the part of the heart of America you and I are both from. So,
But we're closer to Colombia than somebody is.
indeed. But, so as we look forward, there's a lot of talk here in D.C. about the appeal to Washington, to members of Congress. But what about the appeal back in the heartland? Why is this, not just the Colombia Free Trade Agreement being good for Missouri, but why are these types of agreements good for the good people of Missouri?
Well, for the reasons that we've already talked about today, the ability to take advantage of efficiencies in other countries, the ability to have products that are much more easily bought than products that we might be able to produce ourselves, and then of course those same kinds of jobs produce that are here produce a product that's appealing there. You know, Colombia is our biggest single trading partner in South America. The hemisphere matters a lot, and our relationships, as President Duque said, our relationships binding the hemisphere together should be one of our priorities. And in all of the nearshoring or friendshoring or onshoring discussion, frankly, where we live in the middle of the country, we probably benefit from people looking at that. But the jobs that come back will not nearly equal in number the jobs that left. Missouri was a huge shoemaking state for well over 100 years. It had big shoe factories, lots of European, German, and other immigrants that were really good at that kind of manufacturing. We don't have any of those anymore, but we still buy lots of shoes. We buy lots of shoes that cost less probably than we're making shoes, but we sell lots of things that we're more efficient at doing. So recapturing that is important. Understanding the dynamics, as I mentioned before, of trade are politically so difficult because the news focus is always on the jobs lost. It's as I said before, let me repeat myself, it's the 100-person factory that's been there for 125 years that closes, not on the 300 jobs were added 5 and 6 and 12 at a time in other places at the same time. And so, members really don't like to go home and talk about this because, the labor activity is immediately opposed always. There's always a human rights question in every country, and in fact, other countries then question our human rights positions, so you're placed in that. And the safe place politically has been tariffs and protectionism. And both parties essentially are there right now and have been for about 8 years. And there'll be a price to be paid for that by working families if we don't do something about that. And there'll be a price to be paid for that in our important defense and other relationships if we begin to withdraw from these agreements that have brought us together.
President Duque, let me pick up on something you said in your last response. So let me take it a step further. What are the implications? What is the impact if the U.S. pulls back from these trade conversations, doesn't engage in enterprise diplomacy, particularly with our friends and neighbors? What's the impact of that, do you think?
Let me respond with the counterfactual, because I think the counterfactual is very important to analyze the benefits of the free trade agreements. When you look, for example, at the economic weight of the United States GDP versus the European Union, I will tell you that maybe 10 to 12 years ago, the debate was whether the European economy was going to grow faster than the United States. And in fact, the US GDP has literally doubled against the European GDP. And it has been doubled pari passu with the expansion of all these trade deals. So the first question is, has trade benefited the United States economy to grow? The undisputable answer is yes. Has trade allowed the U.S. to promote more of its FDI in strategic investments in different countries? The response is yes. Now, when I think about, for example, the term nearshoring and friendshoring, a lot of people argue that that has to be embraced because it's too dangerous to be so far away in countries that we don't know if later on they will be friendly with the United States. I think that's a political, maybe diplomatic argument, which should not be dismissed. You need to have it there. But I'm going to give you two of the most powerful arguments on why Latin America and the Caribbean represent not only a strategic opportunity, but a consequential opportunity. One has to do with the environment. When you look at a country like Colombia, Colombia has one of the lowest levels of emission per point of GDP compared to Mexico, to Brazil, to Argentina, to Peru, and to Chile. Which means that a dollar invested in Colombia is a greener dollar than maybe invested in some of those other countries. Also, the energy matrix. In Colombia, the energy matrix, 75% comes from hydro, and now almost 15% comes from non-conventional renewable like solar and wind. So you're going to have a greener investment, you're going to have a much better energy matrix, and then the other thing has to do with labor standards. Because it's not only nearshoring or friendshoring. In the particular case of Colombia, we have signed more ILO resolutions that have become impairing in Colombia than even the United States, which means we're looking for a higher standard on labor markets. So that's also, in ethical terms, is very important. So I would say, Mark, I would love to see the trade speech and the moral case for trade agreement being more vocal here and also being able to demonstrate the benefits that it has brought to the United States. And I think if the United States keep on looking at trade strategically, and obviously it's not the same thing to have a free trade agreement with a Latin American country than maybe with a country like India, for example. I think trade has to be seen as one of the most important strategies for the U.S. to keep on reaching larger aspects of economic growth and benefit to the American people. And I'll close by saying this. I visited many states during the free trade agreement negotiations. Ambassador Barco was working every day, tireless, and I was working at the IDB. And I remember that she used to call me when I was a young technocrat working at the IDB saying, why don't you come with me to this meeting? Why don't you come with me to this conversation? Because when you look at the arguments state by state, When you go to Florida, and let me just finish with this beautiful example. What does Colombian flowers represent to Florida? Yes, Florida receives the Colombian flowers and deploys the Colombian flowers. But you know what happens? The Colombian flowers come to Florida, and they come with trucks all along the East Coast with the thermokines on at 70 cents per ton. But that allows those trucks to come down the East Coast to Florida with the thermokin off at 15 cents per ton. So that trade is also important for the competitiveness of many of the internal economies in the United States. And if this is showcased state by state, you will find out that this has been beneficial in all the possible ways, not only to the U.S. economy, but to the U.S. working class.
We've heard from our panelists the importance of making the case for trade and economic statecraft and enterprise diplomacy, and that's why we had this event today, to try to shed some light on the discussion by giving a great case in point. So our Gildenhorn Fellow, the Van Duque Center, and we're always delighted to have Carolina when we can. Thanks to all of you, and we look forward to moving forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.